Hello and welcome to the Merri-Cast. Today we have a departure from our usual format. We're here to celebrate the life of the late, great Charles Handy, who sadly passed away at the end of 2024. Charles was a social philosopher and one of the greatest thinkers on leadership and management that we've ever known. He massively influenced both my journalistic and entrepreneurial thinking. Now, many of the subjects that Charles tackled are as relevant today as they were in the past. So whether you're working in a startup, a scale-up, someone with a persistent entrepreneurial itch that they want to scratch, or maybe just plain curious about Charles Handy and his life, then this episode is for you. We needed a whole panel rather than our usual one guest to do justice to the life of Charles Handy. And so today's panel includes some truly inspiring voices. Firstly, you'll hear from Kate Handy, Charles's daughter. Kate is an osteopath and Pilates teacher who, of course, grew up with one of the great social philosophers of our times. She brings amazing insights into his work, as well as, of course, a deeply personal perspective. Next, we have Mark Goyder, the founder of Tomorrow's Company, a previous guest on this show and a long-time advocate for purposeful and values-led businesses. Mark's work on stewardship and long-term thinking has greatly influenced corporate governance and makes him both a key voice around Handy's legacy and also its enduring relevance for today's entrepreneurial journey. And finally, we have Andrew Hill, senior business writer at the Financial Times and consulting editor for FT Live. Andrew is the author of a couple of business books in his own right, and his award-winning insights make him an invaluable member of this panel. And, as you'll hear, Charles also has a special place in my heart from my early days in journalism. More of that later. But the star of this episode, of course, is Charles Handy himself. Together, Kate, Mark, Andrew and I will be exploring the man that he was and some of his most powerful books like The Age of Unreason, The Flea and the Elephant, The Second Curve and others, and asking the question, what do these ideas really mean for the challenges of today? So let's get into it. I started with Kate Handy. The obvious question was, what was it like growing up with someone so widely read and listened to? So that's exactly where we started.
Well, I suppose when I was young, he was just a father that wasn't around very much. We used to sort of jokingly call him the man who came to lunch on Sundays. That was very much when he was in the London Business School. And then we moved to Windsor when I was in secondary school. And I think then it was just a bit annoying because people would say, oh, Charles Handy. And I would want to be my own self, of course, not somebody's daughter. And then it meant that we had interesting people coming to stay and coming round. But I don't think, because Dad's work wasn't sort of going to an office at that point, I think his work was very much, he lived his work. So when we sort of talked about his work, it all seemed rather obvious. It didn't seem groundbreaking or extraordinary. It was about how to be a better human being, really.
So it just fitted in naturally with,
Yep.
with his work. It was sort of authentic all the way through. I should say, for the benefit of the listeners, that my own involvement was in my very first job was as an editor of Charles's column on Management Today magazine, which was the easiest first job you could ever have in journalism because his copy was so sort of pristine and clear. And I felt sometimes I had to justify my existence by suggesting some things about like the odd full stop or comma here or there. But what about you, Mark? First of all, can you say a little bit about Charles Handy's work and how it's influenced your own thinking and career? Do you have any particular memories you'd like to share on that?
Well, yes, there are two, Trevor, particularly. The first is getting a phone call one day from Charles after I'd given one lecture at the RSA and met him once thereafter, and him just saying, I think you should come and work at the RSA. And like a fool, I turned him down. I felt that the sales and marketing job I was doing in some printing company was far more important to make work. And when the company concerned turned around to me and said, we don't think you're making a great success of this, about 3 months later, I was on the phone to Charles and saying, have you filled that job yet? And fortunately they hadn't. So then I went to see him and we talked about this job at the RSA, the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, where he was chair. And the thing I remember particularly about going to see him in Putney was him saying to me, and if you do succeed in the interview, he said you should insist that you work a day at home. Now this was 1990, and he said it's absolutely ridiculous for people doing the kind of hybrid creative job that you're going to be doing. For you expect to be in the office every day, and I felt that was a telling example of both his awareness of where things were going and also his great belief in breaking a few rules along the way. And if I may, the second memory I have, I've been I keep a journal, or at least I have for about the last 25 years, and I've been searching through that, and I came across this entry from 2003, August 2003, where Conker, my wife, and I went to visit the Handys in Norfolk. Liz, actually, Kate, was at the osteopath's. And Charles, our memorably intimate conversation with Charles was punctuated by her phone calls reporting progress to the osteopath. But then I said that Charles is in steady retreat from the world. We found him making bread. He talked a little sadly about the difficulty in getting the real policymakers to read his books. He'd advocated road pricing 10 years ago, and nobody noticed. Similarly, he'd argued against the folly of targets. And then I went on to talk about how they were not quite pulling up the broad drawbridge in Norfolk, but planting trees and settling and mellowing there. And finally, this on Kate, on your mother. Liz's, quote, aggression, unquote, and impatience is acknowledged by Charles to be the only reason he did not die on the golf course as a retired Shell mediocrity. She kicked him out of Shell, out of London Business School, where his teaching effort went into the spoilt and privileged, and ultimately into independent existence.
Just on that, actually, just before I come to you, Andrew, I mean, I was looking at Simon Calkins, somebody who I'm sure we all know, sort of obituary, when Charles sadly passed away, talking about how the time when Charles found himself at Shell HQ greeted by a 3-page list of responsibilities on his desk with no name on it, and that struck him as not very human. And Liz more forcibly gave him to understand that seeing the adventurous expat she had married turned into a dull office drudge was not part of their life's plan. But Andrew, tell me about how Charles has influenced your sort of thinking and work.
When was that, Mark, that you said you had your visit to Norfolk?
That was the 14th of August 2003.
So, I mean, what's interesting about that, because my personal encounters with Charles all came in later life, starting, I guess, when I started to be the FT's management editor in about 2010. And I think the first interview that I did with him was 2013. So, as we know, I mean, he went on working and thinking and indeed writing almost right until the end. So, in that respect, 2003 sounds pretty early to be pulling up the drawbridge, because I think there was plenty of traffic across that drawbridge in the 20 or more years from that. So, my initial interest was a sort of connection, I suppose, forged about the feeling that organizations needed to be doing more than simply answering, key performance indicators, meeting targets, producing profit. So it linked with some of the thinking that I had been doing for a while about purpose-led organizations. And I was particularly taken, because I was obviously in mid-career at that point, by his book, The Second Curve, which I reviewed and talked to him about, and which we may talk about later, as a way of thinking about how one moves through the portfolio life that he had presciently talked about many decades before. Of course, I ended up staying at the FT, so I'm not quite sure whether my second curve has happened within the FT or whether it's still to happen. But that was very inspirational to me. And that's a book that I go on recommending and indeed handing out to people who in turn talk about how it's inspired them. So long after your 2003 drawbridge pulling up, Mark, I think there was still plenty going on there.
Yeah, you're right, Andrew. We will get onto the second curve. I mean, my first awareness of Charles sort of, predated the sort of editing his sort of column was with the Age of Unreason, sort of, which I think came out late 80s, early 90s, and that was, to me, was all about an inspiring vision of an era of new discoveries, new enlightenment, new sort of freedoms. Now, Kate, your father often encouraged people to step outside the conventional paths and question the status quo. I mean, was that something he encouraged in you as well? Did he teach you to live the life of the Age of Unreason?
I think he gave us a healthy disregard for fame and big organizations, but he also definitely encouraged me to look for customers and not jobs. And I think made me completely unemployable, actually. So I have run a lot of my own little businesses and not worked very long for other people. In fact, I don't think I've worked for anyone longer than about 4 months, apart from one person, and I ended up marrying him. So yes, he would make us quietly question everything, pretty much. And I have changed careers many, many times and never said I can't do anything, really. I think
Right.
he was a great person for learning while doing, not just reading the book on it.
I think Kate has raised something really important, which I think was absolutely fundamental to Charles's influence, not just on me, but I think on the world, which was the questions that he asked. So he got me involved in the RSA, and then I'll never forget it. And I have a feeling, Kate, that you may even have been there when he was talking to me about this, because I think it was the time you came with him and Liz and visited us in Suffolk, and he said to me, I'm thinking of giving a lecture, and I was thinking of asking the question, what is a company for? And that was 1990, just after I joined the RSA. And I said to him at the time, well, that sounds interesting. You give the lecture and let me see what we can do on the back of it. And of course, that was he sowed a seed there, which is tomorrow's company. And so yes, brilliant open questions, which I think is a hugely important part of anybody's education.
Absolutely. He said I should, if I ever went for an interview, that I should interview them to see whether it would be a place I would want to go rather than let them interview me. And that's worked brilliantly.
Andrew, is there anything you want to add there at all? Or?
No, I was just thinking about the open questions and the famous empty chair exercise that he used to do in kind of inviting people to come and discuss the questions that were foremost in their minds. And I think the element of questioning was absolutely critical. That right through all the books, obviously, but as his frustration with that in that visit that Mark made to Norfolk in 2003 suggests, also continuing to have these radical ideas and to ask the questions, like what is a company for, about almost any institution that he came across. I think that kind of natural suspicion, Kate, that you mentioned of large organizations led him to think about ways in which one could do things better, and asking the question of people when he met them who actually weren't used to having their ideas challenged. Again, another valuable part of his work.
Actually, Andrew, I mean, just while we're at it, I mean, there's so many book titles we could choose from Charles's work, but was there a particular favourite that influenced you most at all?
Well, I was going to think about I was going to mention the Age of Unreason as well, actually, partly, because it did lay out very clearly those kind of elements that would make up what we now almost universally call a portfolio career, but which wasn't actually a term really out there at all before that, I think, 1989 book. So the idea of being able to divide up the things that you do into wage work, I'm not going to get them all, fee work. The one that I remember was, gift work, being able to give away part of your time to voluntary organizations. And then I think there was study and obviously what happens in the home. I thought those were really interesting. I mean, that's an inspiring way to think about one's life. Even now, nearly 40 years on.
And I suppose, oh, by the way, Kate, so before we go on to that, I mean, were you an avid reader of your father's books at the time? I mean,
Yeah, I loved his thoughts for the day.
yeah.
But when he started talking about management, I think I just sort of tuned out. It was businessmen to me meant people who go on and on about something that doesn't affect my life but makes them money. But I love his 21 letters and myself and other more important matters. But his 21 letters, I think, beautifully summarizes a lot of his messages. And that was written, of course, to my brother's children and my children. His later books I love because I think he stopped trying to write management books. And for me, maybe that's because I got older as well and I didn't see them as management books. I saw them as being a better human being book. And I'm actually dipping into his old books a lot more and understanding what he was saying a lot better. But a lot of the stuff he wrote about to us was normal because Dad lived his life like that. He did gift work. He shared his career with Mum and did 6 months his work, 6 months her work, and they had to ask each other permission. One cooked in one house, one cooked in the other house. They loved talking to people. They would never take a job unless the person would pay for extra days either side, introduce them to artists and creators nearby and the young business entrepreneurs. We just thought that was normal.
That's fascinating because just as in the books, we were talking about ideas that were ahead of their time, sort of, that he was talking about, and sort of there are sort of numerous examples of that. Outside of writing books, he was doing things that a lot of people didn't do for years or decades later in their relationships and so on. I mean, my experience. So I met Liz as well because she was the photographer for the columns that I was editing for Charles, and there was, I didn't know that when I started editing the column, and then it became.
I bet you knew it pretty quickly after you started.
Yeah. That's right. It became very apparent very clearly through sort of Liz herself that was the case, and also I came to love the work that she did. Mark, I mean, was there a particular work that you think, I think you may have hinted at it earlier on, that influenced you most?
Well, there's one book I wish I'd taken more notice of at the time, which was The Second Curve, because as Tomorrow's Company has passed through various near-death experiences on its journey, I think that, well, even before he wrote it, if I look back, I think Charles was probably asking me, where's the next step, and I wasn't noticing it enough. But actually, the autobiography, myself and other important matters, I find very powerful and rich to revisit. And just one example, and I was looking at it the other day in preparation for this, was his comment about, he said, Shell had taught me, perhaps unintentionally, that warehoused learning doesn't stick. Unless the lesson and the experience are tied together, the learning evaporates. Now, that gem has actually, and a lot of the conversations I had with Charles later on has actually inspired me and in the future direction of Tomorrow's Company, because we're very much talking now about the experience of 14 to 15-year-olds who they're not getting the experiences that would compensate for the warehoused learning that they're having inflicted on them. And I think Charles, when he was at the RSA, he was involved with a great movement called Education for Capability with a whole lot of other people. At that time, was championing the same idea that we need to bring out the diverse qualities, as the non-academic, the practical, the musical, the craft, the human, the emotional qualities in education. And I got a lot of that from revisiting his wonderful autobiography, which, by the way, was written just after that 2003 visit. So I think at that time he was, Andrew, in a very reflective mood.
I preferred his books after that. I thought they created a much bigger audience. They weren't just management books. He was then seen as more of a social philosopher. And he's been quite right. And I think education in some ways has got a little worse and more focused on academics, where the answer is in the back of the book. And he was saying, especially now with AI, we certainly don't want to be teaching our kids to learn things where the answer's in the back of the book. You want to get them to try and answer things where there isn't just one answer, and it certainly hasn't been talked about before. We need the creatives to be in charge of AI and where the future goes.
I was just going to add that I think that what Trevor mentioned there about always Liz and Charles always wanting to make sure that they saw the creative people wherever they went. I wanted to add to that, the obvious thing that he managed to do, which really is an inspiration as I head into later life, but the way in which they stayed connected to people by inviting them, by making sure that they met the younger cohorts of people and places that they visited, just staying inspired, if you like, not just inspiring, but also making sure that there was something that they were breathing in these encounters, I think really is a lesson for anybody, not to head into retirement and close off from the world, but actually to open up and say, I want more people telling me more ideas, what's happening, what can you tell me about what's new? That's very inspiring, I think.
I think that's why the gift work is so important, because Dad was saying, he could earn his money if he worked out what was enough with the big elephants and the people who pay loads of money, but actually wasn't what he could teach should be available for everybody. So therefore they actually searched out, like working for Tottenham after the riots and going to Palestine. Gosh, that was when my daughter was born. So, so you can't give birth early. We're in Palestine, and very important. Different slums in Ireland, and that was where they got their. They really understood what was needed, what was the problem, what wasn't happening, because it was being lived on a daily basis rather than just being work.
Yeah, I'm glad that we're starting to sort of we referred to the second curve and also one other from mine. Actually, I think Andrew, you wrote a review of The View from 90, right towards the end of his life, in which you were saying that that Charles was pleasantly surprised he'd managed to live such a contented life, in line with, as you said, Aristotle's precept of doing your best at what you're best at for the good of others. I was surprised that he was pleasantly surprised, because he put himself in a position where he was exposed himself to so many sort of new experiences and so open to all these things. And I think we've touched on that, and also, is there something that we could be saying, or that Andy's work, Charles's work, says to sort of people of the new generation, who I fear sometimes, yes, they might go sort of traveling or something, but in so many ways are kind of going down these kind of social media silos, or being encouraged less to sort of be curious than perhaps they were. I don't know if anyone's got any sort of comments on that, about what we can say about Charles's relevance, of which I'm sure there is great relevance to where we are now.
Well, Kate, I'd love to hear from you about the grandfather influence when you've been bringing up children not that far from the current angst. I can't remember how old your children are now, but they're not that.
15 and 18.
Well, there you go. I mean, so tell me what the influence was there.
Well, I mean, extraordinarily enough, the name that the grandchildren gave to Dad was Gaga. Of all the people who's not Gaga in the world, that would be him. But also, that's why he wrote his 21 letters, because he said, they're not going to listen to me now. I'm just a silly old man, but they'll listen to me later. And in their earlier life, he said, I don't really... when they can spell dictionary and discuss Aristotle, then I will be useful. But, he wanted people, I think, to be quietly questioning. He always wanted people to think about what was enough, and to think that their job doesn't dictate their life, that in a nice Italian way, that your life can be more important than your job. and especially in these days when everything is flexible, he said, just work out what is enough and what you need. And then from then on, like for my husband and I, when we had children, we said we want to take our children and pick them up every day from school. And that is an important non-questioning. And we can work till 9 o'clock at night, as long as we've got that time. And I think he would want people to have a really healthy disregard for rules and laws that could be just made for other people's convenience and not exemplary pathways to follow. And in his life, I think the one thing he got excited about and talked about work that I remember is when he won the award for his article on federalism, which was, gosh, back in the 90s. But that's the one thing I remember him being incredibly proud of.
Kate, could you on that one? I mean, just for the benefit of our younger listeners, could you just explain what that was? The work on federalism.
I think it was for one of you two might correct me. Was it for the Harvard Business Review, or it was an American award that you could put articles for, and I think he won it in the 90s and talked about federalism, which was basically Elephant and The Flea.
Right. The federal organization and all that. Yes.
Yeah, about having a big organization. We don't want a king at the top and everything go down from there. That actually, you need your little people around, and everybody needs to be good at their own thing and respected for that. But everybody has to come together for a common good, and coming together for power, for change, but also not making one person in charge.
And didn't he talk about, sorry to interrupt, Kate, but didn't he talk about the principle of subsidiarity, which was a great sort of time-honored principle within the Catholic Church, and the idea that it's a sin to give authority to a higher level in an organization than is strictly necessary?
Absolutely. And that's what he thought about. I think he had a very great phrase, was, light the small fires in the darkness and let's burn the lot down. He was a very quiet revolutionary in that way, but he really did not believe in somebody lording over somebody else and taking away people's ideas and mistakes and individuality.
I mean, I think that thing about I'd written down, I can't remember whether it was from one of the books or maybe an interview that I'd done about him talking about the need for organizations to remain small and personal, and even large organizations trying to retain in some way their ability to meet people at that kind of lowest and smallest level possible, most human level possible, rather than becoming that impersonal organization that poor old Shell got tagged with from the beginning of his career. And I think those ideas for kind of younger entrepreneurs or those coming through and starting up companies, those seem to me to be the really valuable points, because obviously, if you start something, you hope that it's going to get bigger, because then you can have a bigger effect on the world and so on. But as soon as you get bigger, you start to acquire or accrete some of those natural sort of bureaucratic things that slow you down and make you more likely to become that less personal, less human place. So there's some really valuable lessons there from Charles about that human level on which organizations ought to try to maintain their interaction with the people who make them. And again, another handy-ish idea of organizations being made up of people rather than just structures and rules and responsibilities.
And made up of villages. So you would only have a certain amount of people that you would actually know their names.
Yes.
So no more than 90, 100 people. And he would question, what is success and what is growth? Are both of those things just measured financially? And actually, when you make more money, you have to spend more money to make it. And what is success? What is your idea of success? what is your idea of growth and what is your idea of enough? And once you have a few questions like that going, and then my mother would come in and say, okay, let's do your still life. Now you've discovered what your company is about, and choose 4 objects in a plant, and we will make an actual creative image. And if you can't work it out, well, go away again and come back when you can. And I think that put a really human visual, I mean, it's like a sort of your family emblem or your family.
Sort of, yes, a crest, a family crest.
Yeah. That's what it was. It was like a company crest. And she did it with individuals, but especially with companies. It was really interesting for them to sit down and discover the objects, and it could not be technology. You can't have a phone.
Yes. Tara, I'd like to ask both of your other guests, did Charles talk, as you recall, about organizations that he did admire? We've talked quite a lot about what he was critical of, but organizations that he did admire.
That's a tricky one. I can't, off the top of my head, think of particular, certainly contemporary organizations that I remember him mentioning and saying great work that they're doing at Marks and Spencer or Unilever or indeed the Church of England. You know, that I can't think of any obvious examples.
He was into individuals, not organizations. So
I was listening to an interview I'd done with him that I'd actually forgotten that I'd recorded before coming on, where he talked about, where one of the things he says was, put not your faith in institutions. So, you know, that's a fairly clear example. He's not going to necessarily choose an institution, certainly, to say that I would have said maybe some of the smaller organizations that he visited in some of the works. Kate, you may remember this better than I did, but I remember him sending a rather beautifully produced book within the last 10 years that they'd done, I think after visiting, it was an illustrated sort of photographic illustration of some of the organizations that they may, or smaller places they may have visited. I've got
they went
somewhere.
To Malawi. They went.
Yeah, I think that might have been one of those trips. So the human level, the human level organization.
The women starting up the companies because the men were off at war. So, and they had to bring up the children and.
Yes,
I think that there's, for my observation on this, is when I've had conversations about the work of Charles sort of in the past, is that you've got the things around, you know, as you said, Andrew, about the power of being small, you know, sort of small entrepreneurs, you know, I mean, you know, Flea and the Elephant. And by the way, dear listener, we will reference all of these book titles in the show notes so that you can go to them and read them for yourself. But things like the Elephant and the Flea, about, you know, entrepreneurs who can move quickly and fast. That's sort of entrepreneurs in their own right. But I would say, if you're talking, Kate, about you know, influence within larger organizations and being very much more at the person rather than the organization, I think there are a lot of people who have said to me that they were intrapreneurs within organizations, and they were able to start their own small fires, as you were saying, and get things going. So don't, I would say, let's not underestimate the impact that he did have within even big organizations, albeit small kind of village fires within those organizations where maybe the influence was limited to the department or the subsidiary or so on. But I think there was a lot going on in terms of sort of influence, certainly from my observation. I'd quite like to sort of talk a little bit around things like about the way the world has changed and what about us. I mean, Charles said that we will not survive unless we adapt to the way the world is changing. And you know, this show is sort of largely for those of an entrepreneurial bent. I mean, what's the biggest mindset shift that we're going to need today? You know, what could we, you know, how could we link sort of what Charles has said? And there's so many things, but in terms of the biggest shift in what's going on in the way people are sort of thinking and acting. Tough question, but I'm going to throw it open.
One of the things that particularly we haven't talked about as a quality of Charles, which I think is relevant to your question, is the ability to listen to everyone. Because I'm just thinking that you could argue that a world of social media and AI, curiously, while making every piece of information available to you, has a strange way of channeling out the listening to everyone. And when I was talking to my wife Conker about this, she was saying that it was extraordinary wherever he went. And she remembered one of my birthday parties he'd come to, and he was talking to some of her fellow primary teachers. And she remembers a few months later seeing an article which she thought was clearly derived from a conversation that he'd had with them. And so I think that however we're going to solve the issues that we're facing now, we need to counteract the kind of influences that both centralize information. They centralize the power of information, even as they're decentralizing the sort of access to information, if you see what I mean.
Mm.
I guess I would add, I think that's true. I think if you were saying what's a big mindset shift, I'm not sure it's a mindset shift. I think it's almost like retaining the mindset that says our human capabilities are more important than the extraordinary technological capabilities that we can now enlist. Clearly, as an entrepreneur, you've got huge advantages now, even more than entrepreneurs of 5 years ago, because you've got these technological tools of great power that you can enlist to try and mimic some of the things that previously only large organizations could do. But the temptation there, as somebody put it to me the other day, that nobody goes into business to be the CEO of a company that consists of a CFO and 3 large language models. You're kind of, it's about the humans in the machine, if you like. And I think that's almost like us maintaining a mindset that reminds us what we can do as humans rather than what we can do with the machines. And I think that's something one could draw from Charles's work, even long pre-internet or pre-AI.
You would imagine, I don't know, Kate, whether you had any conversations with him in later times, but one might imagine that thinking about AI, one would have a fascinating discussion with Charles about, well, who is going to program the ethical judgment of the large language machines? Who is going to program the emotional intelligence of the same? And I guess that, in a sense, is where Andrew's thoughts are leading us.
And it may be the person who shouts the loudest or waves the largest wedge money. Yeah. And I think a great thing that Dad, right to the end, the magic was in the room. And we seem to do a lot, as we are right now, doing things by social media, by Zoom. But we are all these sort of head creatures. We could be completely naked below the chest. We're not seeing the whole person. You have the magic when you're in the room. So make the effort and meet people. Make the effort and interview people. Don't let your AI weed it out. You would have missed me for sure. I don't tick all the boxes. And that is really important. And he loved going to people's homes. He loved asking people outside the box questions, which hopefully would lead them to their passion, which usually isn't to do with work, but can be even more exciting if it is. And I think that's what we could lose at the moment.
Do you
Trevor,
think... Yes, please take on.
Sorry, could I ask Kate another question? If Scott were here, your brother Scott, if Scott were here, can you think about what would he want added to the conversation in terms of his appreciation of his dad?
Well, I think Scott loved the fact that we didn't have a chief in charge. My dad wasn't leading, telling us all to catch up. He very much was watching, trying to keep his thoughts quiet, which of course he never completely did. And that allowed us to be who we are and who we will become. And I think that is a wonderful way of leadership, because in a family there is a bit of leadership, isn't there?
Indeed.
And so, if Charles were sort of listening to this sort of conversation, about his work and ideas, it wouldn't be a question of him himself being sort of pleased or slightly embarrassed or any other kind of emotion. He'd just be fascinated, locked into the ideas and, whether the ideas were being discussed. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think he'd feel it a little bit ridiculous talking about his life. He'd want, as we have to look back over his life, he'd want to think of the ripples going forwards, what could still be the outboard motor keeping you going in a direction. And sure enough, you can learn things from the past, but you really only learn by doing it.
Okay, I'm going to start to bring the discussion to a close now. I mean, this podcast is all about celebrating the life of Charles Handy, and with particular reference to in the world of sort of entrepreneurs. I mean, is there something that you think he would be saying to somebody who was just starting out on their entrepreneurial journey? I mean, and it's a question for all three of you, really. That if there was one thing that somebody who was listening to this podcast who hadn't particularly come across the work of Charles Handy before, was if there was one thought or one action that they should take on board. Is there something in particular that you think that if you remember nothing else about Charles's work, it would probably be this?
I think if the context is somebody starting out in any business sense, I can hear him, and I remember on one occasion, particularly Liz, saying, for goodness sake, don't stuff your organization full of overheads. Be agile, be small, be the flea rather than the elephant. Be free to move fast and move on. So for for an entrepreneur, I think that's what I would hear him warning against.
Pick one, and this comes from a meeting I had with him. Well, a meeting. It was a game of croquet. I went out to New York to Norfolk and played croquet for an FT magazine feature, which we call Pastimes. And Charles loved croquet. And at that stage, 2019, it was after Liz's death, after he'd had his stroke and he was recovering. And I was warned that possibly he wouldn't be able to take to the croquet lawn. But as soon as I got up to practice a few strokes, he was up on his feet wanting to take part. And in the course of the discussion that we had in relation to croquet, he said something that I still wonder whether it wasn't just quite cleverly thought of as being a little lesson he wanted to impart. But in the game, he said, the direct route isn't always the best one. And I like that as a kind of handyism, if you like, for the way in which one might approach a career as an entrepreneur, or indeed in any field of work.
And fittingly, I think the last word, Kate, should go to you.
Well, I think he always, because I have had quite a few careers, he was always saying, go for your passion. Make sure it's not a financial thing that you're trying to reward yourself, but it's something that fills something inside you. And stay curious, because as what Andrew says, it doesn't always take you where you think it's going to take you. If you stay curious along the way, it may lead you in a much better place.
I mean, I really love that last point from Kate Handy about the unexpected destinations that come through curiosity. I don't even know where to begin with that whole discussion, to be honest with you. It had so many great points, but I suppose highlights for me personally, well, we'll start with Kate. I mean, Kate brought out Charles, of course, from a more personal perspective. Charles Handy's underlying drive for us to be basically better human beings. I mean, have a healthy disregard for certain rules and assumptions set by others. His love of very basic questions like, what is a company, that got us all thinking and acting differently, and encouraging us, as Kate put it, to light those small fires in the darkness. And right to the end, she told us that Charles had magic in the room whenever he was there, driven by being curious about people and the world we live in. From Mark, I picked up how forward-thinking Charles was, from talking about hybrid working about 30 years before everybody else got round to it, his enduring relevance to today's world, and the importance of putting yourself in situations where you are, as Mark said, listening to everyone and seeking out views. Particularly important in an age of social media and technology, which, for all its virtues, risks the ghettos of ignorance, disruption, and division. And I loved what Andrew said about the need for organisations to remain small and personal and human, and the need to retain the mindset of humanity and encouraging human capabilities. At the end of the day, of course, it's all about humans in the machine in this age of AI. Finally, Charles Handy taught me to think differently, to stay curious and to build my business with purpose. And those values, I promise you, will continue to guide this podcast and along the way in my own entrepreneurial journey. So a final thank you to Kate Handy, Mark Goyder and Andrew Hill. And that brings us to the end of this very special episode celebrating the life of Charles Handy. And of course, thank you as always to you, our listeners, for joining us in this very special episode. And if you enjoyed it, please subscribe, rate and review wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow us and the work of Merriborn by looking up Trevor Meriden or Merriborn on LinkedIn, or heading to our website, merriborn.co.uk. That's all for now, and until next time, thanks for listening.